And now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Amber Tatman, Senior Consultant and Investment Advisor at NRS, a comply-side company. Amber?
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. As Amanda mentioned, I am Amber Tatman, Senior Consultant with NRS, which is proud now to be a comply-side company. I'm excited to be here today and especially excited to be joined by our expert speakers, starting with Beata Born, Head of Global Business Management at SIX, and Justin Culla, Partner at TCP Group. If I could ask you both now to give a brief introduction, that would be wonderful. Beata?
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Beata Born, sometimes Venlo Born, depending on which social media profile you look at. And I will bring a bit of a banking, regulatory, and data view to this webinar. I'm currently the Global Head of Business Management at SIX Financial Information in Zurich. That's essentially the COO position for SIX. So that also includes some aspects of ESG strategy, both in the area of product development, so making money with ESG, and also sort of the corporate social responsibility aspect, so making sure you're not doing any harm. I do have a good 15 to 18 years of, depending on how you look at it, of experience in financial services. For example, my last position was at UBS, where I was head strategic projects, running a whole portfolio of multi-million-dollar programs. Included regulatory stuff like MiFID, and it included Brexit and so on. And lastly, one thing that might be relevant for this panel as well is I've just recently acquired a master's degree from the University of Cambridge in sustainability leadership, where I researched carbon disclosure comparability. So this topic is close to my heart. I've got some work relations with it, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. Justin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Culla. I'm a partner at TCP Group. We are a New York-based lower mid-market private equity firm. We manage a little over $2 billion of capital through 5 funding strategies. We have 2 buyout funds, a mid-market and a small cap, a growth equity fund, and a SPAC. And I joined to launch our impact investing team, which invests across all 4 of those verticals. And I also lead ESG across our firm-wide portfolio of 30 companies. TCP Group is always been intellectually committed to ESG. We've had a lot of good habits that have been ad hoc, and I joined to formalize that practice, which is still relatively distinct in the lower mid-market private equity world, but in private markets in general.
Great. Well, thank you both. We're excited to hear from you, learn from you both today. As we move forward, we're going to look at the agenda and things we're going to be covering today. Really talking about what is ESG, not a simple question, and how do compliance professionals in financial services navigate the topic, looking a bit at the standards and frameworks, and an interesting discussion on do you comply with ESG or commit to ESG. We'll talk about opportunities for compliance teams and then take your questions. Certainly we'll try to get to them as they fit in during the presentation, but we've allotted some time for afterward as well. And if we can't get to them during this session, we can loop back with you afterward. So let's get started. Our first topic is ESG in the news. And this is just a really quick overview of just anybody Googling the topic, looking it up, you'll see a number of news stories approaching ESG topics from different angles. Certainly those of us in the regulatory compliance space see different stories, perhaps as relevant, but certainly it's a very big topic in general. And sometimes it's hard to kind of cull through all of the plethora of information that's available. Certainly within the last couple of weeks, in the US, the Department of Labor issued a proposal talking, well, that will have the effect, if implemented, of increasing flows into ESG investments in accounts that are covered by ERISA. So, I mean, I think a year from now, we're going to be seeing a lot of progress, and it seems for people that have been in this space for a while, maybe that progress took a little bit of time coming, but I think we're moving a lot more quickly. The SEC has obviously this year started talking about the issue. So I think we can see regulation, hopefully, that clarifies some things for us. There are also starting to be some cases in this space. There's a case, DWS Group, that really speaks to, in that case, a sustainability officer had a different opinion from senior management about, holding out their investing strategy and investments as green. So that greenwashing topic brings up a lot of concerns for a lot of us. And it really comes down to, the fact that there aren't really universally accepted definitions or, frameworks. So that's, I think, part of the problem and something that hopefully we'll get closer to resolution on as we move forward. So again, lots of news in this space. And I think it's a great segue into talking about what is ESG. So as we move to that topic, we'd like to ask you a polling question, asking what area do you think ESG impacts the most? If you could take a quick second, answer that question, and we'll go ahead and move on to the discussion. And we're going to talk, what is ESG? How do you define it? And I'd like to start with Beata, if I could.
Yes, sorry, I had to unmute myself first. Just on that poll, it's obviously very hard to pick one specific part where ESG is applicable, and that's partly because we have such a vague definition of it, right? So when it comes to ESG, I'd like to make 3 points. And the first one is, it is very vague, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we've got one definition that's essentially globally accepted, and that was what the UN Brundtland Commission in 1987 came up with. And they defined it as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Right. So good definition, conveniently vague, and or rather problematically vague. And it can essentially mean anything. So we've got about 1 in 5 people living under the poverty line. We've got about 60 million kids not getting access to education. We've got greenhouse gas emission that has risen by 50% since 1990, even though we have actively tried to reduce it. We have got 40% of the world population affected by water scarcity, and women still make 23% less on average than men. So it's a gender equality issue. And then 40% of oceans are affected by pollution, depleted fisheries, loss of coastal habitat, and so on. So what I just mentioned was just a quick selection of the 17 SDGs. So I only picked out 6, I think, of them, 6 sustainability goals. But you can see only with those, it's very, very broad, and it can be anything, right? The second point I want to make, it's extremely complex. And this is probably why we're all in this webinar today, and while we're struggling with it, because it's, again, everything to everyone and nothing to anyone. When we look at how we've tried, or the global community has tried to tackle this. So in 2015, as I just mentioned, the UN Sustainability Agenda came together, and they defined the 17 sustainability goals, which was a very good start. But then they defined the goals that were supposed to be undermined or underlined by 169 targets. And those 169 targets are supposed to be tracked by 232 indicators. Now, those 232 indicators, about 2/3 of them, we can either have no metrics for, or we've got no data to actually measure those metrics. Additionally, they were set on national level. So it's the nations that have to report on it and not companies. But then again, where do those sustainability impacts come from, right? Yeah, so this is exactly where you see the slide that you're showing now. It shows you, everything that you see here. So those are atop the 17 goals, and you've got 169 targets, and the indicators that are amber or red are the ones we can't measure. So either metrics available, data incomplete, or no monitoring available at all. Now, that's one problem with the complexity of it all. And the third point, which is a bit out of left field, I'd like to make here as well, is that we constantly feel that we need to talk about climate when we talk about ESG, but climate is really only one aspect of the E of the ESG. And it's not the same. It is very important, and it's only SDG 13, but the TCFD, for example, is not sustainability. It is climate only, right? So what's also happened is also in 2015, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came together. They agreed to sign the Paris Agreement, which is something that everybody would recognize. And I think that's where the focus on climate came from to a certain degree. And out of that, the EU Action Plan for Financing Sustainable Growth emerged specifically in the EU area, which is then the basis for the regulations that we're probably going to talk around later that came into effect, trying to create an economy that shows growth, but at the same time is sustainable. So to close off this monologue as to what is sustainability, the point really is, if we want to deal with ESG or sustainability, we need to define what we are doing and what we want it for. Why are we looking at this? And I think this will be a part of what we're going to discuss today in the webinar as well. And then once you know what question you're actually asking, you can then look for the answers and for the right frameworks and the right information around it.
Thank you so much for that. I like what you said about a really important piece here, which is not only are the definitions different, but we could be speaking essentially different languages as we approach it from, the investing side or, the commonly conflated terms. I think sometimes when we hear impact invest, I think that lack of clarity and uniformity really is something that we could all address within our own firms. And Justin, I think you have some pretty clear definitions on how you address some of these commonly conflated terms, I'll say.
Yeah, we've taken great pains to define ESG and impact investing, which are distinct for our firm. When I joined our firm and the basis of this discussion, it is genuinely unclear what these terms mean, and they are often used in interchangeable ways. There's a variety of nomenclature that we're all familiar with that suffer from this. The word sustainable is, another example. Sustainable in English has two meanings: one that infers the environment, and another that just infers longevity. Those are not the same concepts. But they're often interchangeable. So every company is fundamentally striving to be sustainable and that they look to live forever. That doesn't mean that they are doing well for the environment. And it's unclear if you defined it narrowly on the environment, what that would actually mean. The food industry has suffered from this for a long time. The word natural is a term of art that is undefined, so anyone can lay claim to that. It doesn't mean anything. Consumers sometimes confuse that with organic or other actual terms of art. But the use of language is really important. And so when I arrived at my firm, it was important for us to have a clear idea of what we meant by it, so that frankly our partners and our team members knew how to practice it, knew why it was valuable, and we could communicate that to our stakeholders. So as I mentioned, ESG and impact are distinct topics. The way we define them is clear. So ESG is a toolkit that any business can utilize as a way to de-risk and unlock value, take into account the full range of stakeholders that affect the business: management, employees, partners, suppliers, customers, community, the environment. And so when you think about ESG, the best way to think about it from our perspective is there are 7 stakeholders that affect every business. So you can think about that on the y-axis, and every business has risks, strengths, and areas to unlock value. Now, so it's a 7x3 grid. and every business will have things that are material for their business. Some businesses are people-driven businesses, and employees become material. There are risks and there are opportunities related to that. Some businesses have more environmental exposure, and so we do not use the language like a company is good at ESG or bad at ESG. We don't invest in ESG. ESG is a toolkit to assess risk and unlock value. And for us, that's the right way to think about it. It makes us better investors. It helps us clearly communicate with our investors and our stakeholders why they should do it. Because if you're not assessing risk relative to paying people fairly, as Beata mentioned, as you're not assessing risk about how you treat the environment, how you interact with your community, that's a real long-term risk for your business. That is frankly underappreciated in most due diligence activities. And companies oftentimes have things that they can do, but they don't have a structured approach. And so we think about unlocking value, which is a primary lever for private equity. How do we invest in a business and grow that business and create more economic value? This is one of those tools that we use in addition to acquisitions and hiring and investing in new products and other things. Impact investing is distinct. So impact investing, the definition, our definition is where the world positive value is delivered via a product or service to an end customer, aligned to a UN SDG standard, and with measurable outcomes attached. And so very simply, ESG is how businesses act, and impact is what they give to the world. And so when we think about impact investing and we try to understand, is a company impactful, we look at, we apply the impact management project framework, who, what, how much risk, contribution risk, and we start with the who. Who are they looking to serve? Are they an underserved, marginalized, discriminated, disadvantaged group? If the answer to that is yes, it could be that you're selling candy to somebody living at the poverty line. That's not an impactful. You are serving an important group, but that's not impactful. You then have to apply the UN SDGs. So what are you providing? Does it align to a UN SDG? So the combination of the who and the what, plus are there measurable outcomes that you can actually monitor? Because if you can't monitor the outcomes, then it doesn't rise to the level of impact. And so the combination of those three things is a very simple rubric for us to say, is it impactful? And then the details matter. So when we think about, I think the question that you started with, how ESG is being communicated out in the world, and what we read about in the newspapers, oftentimes for the public, ESG is about all the glamorous, sexy, new, cutting edge activities like Tom's having a buy one, give one program, where they, for every set of shoes that they sell, they give one to people in need. And there's a whole variety of activities like that, foundations and treating employees well. But actually, when you think about ESG from a framework perspective, the frameworks like SASB, GRI, TCFD, they don't accommodate any of those ideas. And that's why understanding risks, which really align to frameworks, and we align to SASB, TCFD, and we look to GRI, and we don't align to it strictly. Strengths, which really aligns to the B Corporation methodology, and then we developed a toolkit for unlocking value. It allows us to very clearly describe, we're not reinventing the wheel, we're just simplifying it. And one more point on this, and I think this is sort of the subtext of the conversation today, the E, the S, and the G are an odd federation of concepts. And I think Beata sort of alluded to that. Environment in Europe, environmental concepts are really at the forefront of conversations often. In the US, social has really sort of gained steam in the private markets, especially in public markets too. And governance in the public markets is also an important topic. But environment is probably third on the list in the US context, not for every company, but in general. And so, but how you define the E, the S, and the G are undefined. And so we've taken the E, the S, and the G, we've mapped it to those stakeholders so that we can very clearly say, when we talk about the S relates to employees. The S relates to how you treat the community. The S relates to your partners and suppliers. And so then we can say this company has risks associated with a couple of these stakeholders, if strengths, and then we can figure out remediation plans and areas to unlock value.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from our audience, Justin, asking what were the 3 items you identified on the other axis of the 7 stakeholders, risks and, if you could review.
Risks, strengths, and areas to unlock value. So we can just, let's use an example that we can all understand, because every company fundamentally has employees. When we think about employees, you can think about a set of risks. Do you pay people well? Do you treat people well? Do you promote people well? Do you have pay equity? And you can really understand that there might be regulatory risks associated with not treating people well, not paying people well. But there's also business risk associated with it, where if you live in an environment, especially in the U.S. context, where we have 10.9 million job openings and you're not paying well, your business is going to be at a disadvantage. There are companies who have invested in employees, not necessarily with respect to being the highest paying firms, but they still become employers of choice because employees feel like the culture is great, or they have learning and development opportunities. And so we've actually, for ourselves, defined a 7, again, trying to be clear about what would represent a good employer. We think that a good job has seven dimensions to it: pay, benefits, upward mobility, durability, portability, accessibility, and health and safety. And not every job is going to satisfy all those conditions, but we know that if a company doesn't pay you well and doesn't have good benefits, and doesn't have upward mobility, and doesn't allow you to go into other jobs over time, and is not safe for you to work in, this represents a bad job. And we also know that there are jobs that people generally consider to be good jobs. And so when a company is thinking about those risks and strengths, they can start to map on and say, we're going to be weak here, but we want to invest here as a way to compensate so that we can not have this risk. We can have an advantage.
Great, thank you so much. I think it's really interesting how we've evolved to now seeing ESG concepts as being good business, right? And being a good corporate citizen. I think we have progressed a long way in terms of seeing that they are business concepts. Beate, did you want to weigh in on?
So look, Justin, I think it was really interesting what you mentioned, and what you, without actually mentioning the term, you've basically described the difference between financial materiality and stakeholder materiality, right? And that's, I think, when we're looking at the compliance professional, that's exactly what we have to make use of, rather than looking at one specific framework. I think we need to, again, ask the question, what do we want this for? And you've put them on a matrix, saying, okay, where do I have my strengths? Where are my risks? What do I do well? What don't I do well? So just for the audience, financial materiality is essentially the ESG risks to the company, right? Does ESG somewhere pose a risk to me? And do I have to manage that risk somehow? And stakeholder, and it used to be environmental materiality. They've now switched it sort of to stakeholder materiality, because it's not just the physical environment. It's everybody that you affect around you. The question there is anything that I do as a company affecting my surrounding positively in terms of impact, so to speak, or negatively in terms of a negative sustainability impact. And so a lot of the frameworks that we see, so for example, the TCFD, the SASB, they're all looking at financial materiality at this point, but it's not really enough to come to a full conclusion and a full assessment of a company. And what the EU again has done is they've sort of created this concept of dual materiality, making sure that both aspects are looked at. And that's then called sort of a sustainable economy, and sustainable in the sense of longevity, and also the actual sustainability ESG concept. And so another point I quickly wanted to mention is that so UBS, for example, has come up with a similar structure of evaluating assets around ESG performance, and they've created an ESG fund and portfolio and whatnot. And the difficulty there, and most of the audience would recognize this, is getting the data for it, right? One is asking the right question, and the second is getting the right data. And so now there's the question: where do you source it from? How does it get? How real is the data? Do you run the risk of accidental greenwashing if you just send out a questionnaire and something comes back that's not true, and so on? So that's definitely something that is probably in the future going to get more streamlined with third-party assurance and so on. I just wanted to make those points.
Great, thank you. That's actually a great segue into our next topic about how this impacts financial professionals and compliance. And I think the definitions being clear and having a framework in the absence of universal definitions that you internally can follow, and making sure that you do follow and do what you say you're going to do. I think in the meantime, we had another polling question that had popped up. So hopefully you can see that we're really asking if your firm's involved in ESG investing. So if you could take a quick moment to answer that question, we will move on to our next topic. And that is, again, speaking about why it looks like most people, 62% of attendees are involved in ESG investing, 31% no, and a few not sure. And I think that's part of the issue is it's a fast evolving area. And again, perfect segue into why compliance is getting involved, and why increasingly compliance folks are being tasked with implementing ESG. So we're going to have another polling question right now asking, has compliance in your firm been tasked with implementing ESG across the firm? So yes, no, or you're not sure? And we will move on with the discussion in this space. Speaking again of financial services firms, compliance individuals, obviously compliance people are very interested in regulation. I briefly mentioned the Department of Labor and the SEC and some action in that space. But when we talk about what's voluntary, what's mandatory, what's a framework, and how is it different from regulation? We know the EU has been more active in this space. So can you, Beata, get us started on answering some of these questions in terms of framework versus regulation, and what's mandatory and what's voluntary at this point?
Yes, be happy to. So I think, firstly, I think ESG is greatly underestimated by financial services institutions still. And there's a lot of compliance work to be done. But when we start this process, what we first need to understand is what's actually mandatory and so regulatory, right? And us financial services professionals love regulations because then we know exactly what we're supposed to do and we can follow that, we can tick a box, right? And then there are the things that are voluntary. And the stuff that you've just pulled up on screen, they're voluntary. So they're the main voluntary disclosure standards. And again, so if we're speaking about regulations, most of the requirements, especially for financial services that are out there, are disclosure requirements or disclosure regulations. So we've got, for example, the TCFD, it's a task force for climate-related disclosure. We've got the Global Reporting Initiative, which is the GRI, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the CDSB, so it's an alphabet soup of acronyms. The Carbon Disclosure Project, we've got the Value Reporting Foundation, which is what you would probably still know as SASB and IFRS, and they've recently merged to sort of take a bit of that complexity out. So the big five, we call them the big five standard setters or framework. So standard is more specific, as in it gives you, so SASB, I would say, is a standard. It gives you specific metrics, whereas like a TCFD, for example, is a framework because it sort of nudges you to disclose on what you're doing, how you're thinking on specific topics. Do you have a policy in place that relates to climate and right? So those five have then, I think with the WEF together, come up with a statement of intent to work together, because the industry started complaining around, we just don't know what to do anymore. Who do we report to, and how do we define what, and what actually makes sense? So I think when looking at the voluntary pieces, it makes sense to figure out in your jurisdiction, in your market, what's most relevant. And I think the US does a lot of SASB. I think Europe looks a lot of TCFD. I think the UK has actually implemented it into law. So that makes a lot of sense. But probably pick the combination, as we mentioned earlier, that works best and that gives you the full spectrum, right? And none of those are actually mandatory at this point. Now, when we're moving on to the mandatory side, and I have to apologize to the audience that's not European. I obviously have the European view, and Europe is quite advanced, but it's definitely not perfect in this area. So in the past, most of the prudential and conduct regulations in the financial services space have actually been amended to reflect ESG requirements. So if we take MiFID, a disclosure regulation, for example, that has been amended to reflect MiFID. Basel has been amended to reflect ESG. Basel has been amended to reflect ESG, and so on. And the basis for that was the EU Action Plan for Financing Sustainable Growth, as I mentioned earlier. Now, that alone creates a lot of work for compliance professionals, right? Because you have implemented those regulations once, and now you have to go back and revise what you've done to have it reflect ESG. Now, that's the one point that's quite difficult. We need to make sure that we're on top of all of those topics. And outside of the existing regulations, there's a couple of new ones that have been come out. And there's one, again, we're looking at disclosure regulations, or one packet of three, which I like to call the unholy trinity of ESG disclosure regulations in the EU, are the SFDR, the EU taxonomy, and the NFRD. And to set that into context, the EU Commission Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth has made it its main goal to facilitate channeling private sector funds into sustainable investments. And the basis for that are these definitions in these regulations. So how does this work? The NFRD is the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which is now called the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Disclosure Directive. And that's for corporates that have to disclose. So any, not just financial services, but any firm has to disclose under these regulations. Then on top of it, you've got the SFDR, which is essentially the same thing for financial services. So any financial services firm has to disclose on their entity investments and also on their products that they claim to be sustainable. And the language used for those two is the EU taxonomy, and that is the standard that defines the metrics. So you've got thresholds in there, you've got a definition of economic activity that is either sustainable or not sustainable. So when you publish this, and you either have an economic activity that's sustainability aligned or not sustainability aligned, and for an investment specialist investment advisor, it can be a very good tool, because when you do the calculation in the end, you actually come up with a percentage of 40%, this equity is 40% taxonomy aligned, which at least gives you a ballpark. You know, we can discuss all day long if these metrics make sense and if they're perfect or not, then they're not, but they won't ever be perfect. This document is, I think, 600 pages long, and it only covers climate out of all the ES and the G, right? So in a nutshell, what this does is the data flows from the corporates via the CSRD to the financial services institutions, where it's then used for the SFRD reporting that's only applicable to financial services institution. And then wherever it's possible, the EU taxonomy is used. And that's the last point I want to mention here. In this sort of wherever possible, that's where the devil is in detail. Right? Essentially, the taxonomy is a really good concept, because it does give you guidance. It does define the metrics. It gives us what we want to have. But there are a couple of issues with it. So one, it's super complex, right? 600 pages covering 2 out of 6 environmental objectives, and that's only environment. So if you make the very, very simple math, E, S, and G, you have covered 11% of sustainability topics in that. So what's the statement behind that, really, unless you're only looking at climate, right? Then another point is the EU taxonomy is currently not aligned to the big standards. So the big standards and framework, the voluntary ones, the fact that they're voluntary doesn't mean they're not important. So lots of companies are working with those, they're reporting on those, and now you're all of a sudden overlaying it with this massive task of complying with this, this huge amount of metrics. So there's no real alignment there. So that has to be taken care of at some point. Then the timing within the regulations is off. So the financial services institutions are made to report while the new sustainability requirement for the real economy is not finalized yet, which means they're going to MSCI and Sustainalytics and the like, and they're asking for estimates. And then how good are estimates in this? Right? It's again, you're running into accidental greenwashing very quickly. And then the one point, my last point on this is, do we really want the regulator to define what's sustainable and what's not? And I guess that's a question of, is that how far we want to be controlled? And I think in the US, we're a little more used to having a rule-based regulation, whereas in Europe, we are principle-based. We're used to principle-based. You follow the spirit of the regulation and you can explain it and you're usually okay. And this is not the spirit of the regulation anymore. This is rule by rule by rule. And then looking at how quickly this moves, how quickly these topics move, and the innovation in this space moves as well. Who's to say that, the innovation, the big piece, the big breakthrough piece has gone through the regulatory process of being included in the taxonomy and then gets on the capital markets the right assessment. So for example, I'll give you an example, tobacco is mostly, for most portfolios, it's just excluded, right? You can say you exclude tobacco. So what about Philip Morris International? As a tobacco company that's essentially about to exit tobacco. What do you do with that? So do you just exclude, there are intricacies of this that don't quite work. But yeah, that's sort of where we stand in the EU with the regulatory approach to ESG disclosure.
Well, I'll jump in there because I think that's, you raised a lot of interesting topics that we think through too. From the U.S. context and, frankly, from my own firm's, capabilities, it's been an extremely heavy lift for us to even do what we've done. And I don't even know if it's been an economical investment, or given how much effort we've put in, but we've done that because we think it matters. We've done that because we think it gives us an advantage relative to our competitors, because our stakeholders care, our companies, our employees. We hope our LPs too. But it is extremely an extremely arduous lift to define everything and to measure and to actually hold yourself to a high standard. I think, what Beata is mentioning is that, there's this real challenge, which is that when you think about complying with, just take one of the, non-mandatory, regulations, SASB standards. SASB has 77 different industries. And so oftentimes our companies adhere to a few of them, but not perfectly. And so the nuance ends up mattering, and especially when you think about materiality. And so there's really a balance between how specific do we want to get, although when you become specific, it becomes extremely onerous, 600 pages for SFDR, or do you want to not be specific, but then it's hard to apply in practice. And so that's the conundrum that all of us in this industry are practicing. I do think, from my perspective, operating in a rules-based environment, I do think that we would benefit from a modest amount of rules and guidance from regulatory bodies, because A, we're investing a lot, and so we believe that this should be an advantage for us. And it's hard for others to give us credit if no one knows who's doing what well. And the second is that it is really a heavy lift, and for most groups, it will not be sustainable. It will not be, or sustainable in a longevity perspective. It will not be possible to continue to enact and implement. And so we believe that if there was guidance, that would be helpful. We do think that, and this is where the nuance, the counterfact comes in. We believe that it really does need to be particular to asset classes, the way in which our companies are able to adhere to different standards. When they have 30 employees, very limited environmental exposure, just as an example, is going to be very different than a very large public company. And so we need to make sure that it's the right tool for the right job. And it should be easily understandable. And the other part is that, there is this duality of ESG that I touched on, where the ESG for everybody on this webinar is really about risk. And that's how regulators think about it. That is how practitioners often think about it. But when you read about it in the market, it's often about areas to unlock value. And so I think what would be a quieting effect, for the industry is if any guidance only focused on counting numbers from a compliance perspective and didn't allow and appreciate companies who were committed to doing better. And I actually think that that's sort of core to what ESG is. ESG, in my book, is really not a commitment to being perfect. Just companies are not perfect, and they are living organisms that sort of change and evolve over times. But ESG really is about a commitment to doing better. We treat our employees this way. We have this much diversity at our board, but we're going to do better next year. And here's how we're going to do that. So I do think that regulators need to allow for not only remediation from a risk perspective, but an appreciation from an area to unlock value, because I think that will actually inspire more innovation and more movement here. It'll not feel like just a regulatory burden that people have to comply with in a cost center, but hey, if we do this, this is going to be good for our business. We're going to be rewarded for it. And that's where I think that ESG actually becomes a world positive toolkit. Now, I do think there's one other dynamic that was sort of underlying what Beata was saying, which is the US and EU have taken really different approaches, and it is adding a lot of complexity and confusion. And so SFDR, there are different levels that you can achieve. And if you achieve higher levels, you can access different pools of capital that have said, we only invest at this level. One of the highest levels from an impact perspective is SFDR 9, and that requires companies to make forward-looking statements. In the US context, the SEC prohibits making forward-looking statements. And so that puts investors who want to go after capital in both markets in very tricky positions, especially if they want to be strictly compliant. And so not only do we have to have a strong set of compliance at a national level, but I think we have to have it at an international level. And of course, the other thing that's important to say is that these are a lot of these are global topics, but they're not perfectly applicable. And so, just as an example, I don't know what the split. My guess is that many of the attendees are U.S. based, but maybe not all. In the U.S., diversity has really been put in focus, especially since the murder of George Floyd. But even before that, for a whole variety of reasons, and that racial diversity has really been put in focus. Gender diversity has been in focus for a while, but the topic of diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, has really been put in focus. That's not necessarily true in all EU countries that have different sensibilities. They have different compositions of their populations. It's certainly not the same in Asian markets, as an example. And so I think what we have to do is have a common framework and definitions, but appreciate that the materiality will apply differently in different markets, and that's okay. I think we want the markets to dictate what's important to them. So if a European investor says the environment is more important to us than other matters, well, then capital should flow in that area. But we should have a common set of understanding so that people can actually decide where they want to make investments.
Thank you so much for that. I know this is such a great discussion, and with the time we have remaining, we'd like to turn to compliance teams and talk a little bit about that. I love the phrase "commit or comply," and how you can use your power for good. I think you put it, Beata, which I thought was great. And how do you leverage a topic like ESG to maybe get the seat at the table that compliance people sometimes lack? Any thoughts in that space? We'll start with you, Beata.
So yeah, I think first of all, I think ESG cannot be, we don't have a sustainability strategy, right? We have a corporate strategy that has ESG aspects to it. So we need to decide as a corporation, as an organization, where do we want to stand? And this cannot just be a compliance task. So any compliance professional will have to push back and say, I'm going through this right now. The first question is, are we compliant? Well, compliant with what exactly, right? Are we compliant with regulations? Well, yes, because there aren't any in Switzerland. Is that enough? No, right? So I think there definitely, there's an opportunity to bring this to the platform of a corporate strategy, to bring it up to the board, to make it heard, to say, okay, look, this is definitely a thing we need to do because investors want to know about it, and they don't want any Larifari sort of fluffy boilerplate statement anymore. They want real facts, and they want us, as Justin just said, they want us to report on it. They want us to say, this is where we stand and this is how we're going to change it. There's obviously a business opportunity in this as well, right? For any company, especially in financial services. I mean, the market's hot. The portfolios in ESG investing are performing incredibly well. So what we'll see is once they stop performing, so let's say like a Latin American market, they will divest immediately when it's not performing anymore, and we need to sort of take that into account. So there is a business opportunity, but at the same time, I think we need to be very conscious of the fact: do we want to commit to this long term or not? And it's not just a trend that we run after, like crypto or whatever else it is, right? This is something that's here to stay, and if you're going to do it, you have to invest. It's hugely expensive, and again, you have to commit to comply. Do you just want to do the basics so you're not going to end up in the bad press? And that is fine. Nobody wants you to be the next Greta Thunberg, but at the same time, if you say we want to be a market leader in this, and you actually go out and say this, you got to follow it up, right? So that's like accidental greenwashing is a massive risk here. And then, I mean, I want to touch on something that Justin has said. Basically, what you've explained is a lack of comparability globally, right? And I've tried to tackle this topic actually in my dissertation. I've tried to figure out, by asking industry experts if the EU taxonomy is going to be the right way to go about this, if this is going to fix the problem, right? And I did not get a straight answer. I literally had 50% of the people say yes, the other 50% say no. But what that told me was it was irrelevant. The standard itself is irrelevant. We can pick this one or that one. What changes the system is the mindset of the people, which is, again, very fluffy, but we all need to sort of go in the same direction. And I had a lot of discussions with Asia, the US, and Europe, and there again, being a sustainable company in India is a completely different standard from being a sustainable company in Europe. And if you're a global organization, then you would probably have to look at those things separately, and you have to report on that somehow, right? So yeah, the compliance team itself should probably give advice on the rest, but make sure that you're compliant, because everything else is going to be, and then make sure it all matches, right? So if you're going out and you're doing one thing in your investment strategy and in your let's say wealth management in the products that you sell, but you're doing something else in your own investments, so you're positioning yourself as a market leader, as providing sustainable products, but you're still in your own asset management as a bank, you're still investing brown, that's going to come out somehow. So that is something that compliance need to look at. Is my messaging between communications, between investing and between advising, is that matching or not? And that's not, you won't find that in a regulation or in a standard, but I think that's something that's important to look at. Yeah.
Great. Justin, do you have any thoughts in this space?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is, for compliance officers, it's not like they don't have a full-time job. So this is hard work to do, and I agree with you at this point, which is it's a lot of work. So for many people, it will be about complying to DDQs that come in, to regulatory bodies, and it will be a check the box exercise. I think for professionals who want to invest in this because they believe it's important, I would make as close as you can a financial and economic argument for this being in your firm's interest, and so that doesn't mean you have to make investments across the board, but you can imagine from those stakeholders, how are we treating our employees? How are we treating our partners? How are we treating our managers? And that gives you an advantage for having a conversation, but it also translates what you're seeing in the market. So when you get lots of due diligence questionnaires and you're seeing this demand, at least we do, by our limited partners for what are you doing with diversity? What are you doing in your firm? What are you doing in your portfolio companies? Well, you can start to translate that in business terms to, hey, this is an increasing pressure. If we don't get ahead of this, we may find ourselves really behind. And so we need to put this in our economic interest, not about counting numbers, but making it a priority. And so I actually think that it allows the compliance officers to have a bigger seat at the table when frankly they wouldn't have it in the past, because it connects the compliance with the business objectives. And obviously we know that money talks, and capital cares about this. It will inspire movement. And so this, if anything, should give compliance officers a broader remit and more power within the organization to affect change. But it will require work.
Great. That's I think we could go on for several more hours and still not have scratched the surface on this fabulous topic. We do have another polling question, as well as an audience question. So if we could take a minute and let us know, what are the biggest challenges you see in implementing ESG? I think there are a lot of them, and maybe pick from the choices there. What you see as important. And while you're doing that, let's go on to this audience participant question. What do you think about a possible SEC regulation on mandatory disclosures? It will only cover financially material disclosures and only public issuers. Do you agree with this approach? And is it enough? Any thoughts there?
Justin would be closer to this, but just 2 words from me. I think it's a good start. It's not enough. We can't just go financially material, and that's one of the things that's actually been changed from the NFID to the CSRD, is including smaller companies as well, because we need that comparability. Otherwise, we have no complete set of information.
Yeah, I think the nuance really matters here, and I think as regulations get defined, they need to bring in lots of different stakeholders to opine. I know, even among private equity, the ability to track metrics and to have quantifiable quality data is just different than in venture and then in lower mid-market private equity and other asset classes. And so it's going to be very important that that the regulators take into account lots of different stakeholder views as they understand how this can be practiced in a practicable way.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for the question also. So I know we're exactly at noon. Do you, either one, Beata or Justin, have any quick final thoughts before we close today?
Oh, really? It was a really good discussion. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Amber. I really enjoyed this. For anybody out there that's got some particular questions, reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. So thank you very much. It was great.
What I'll say is that, from our perspective, we may be wrong, but we think that this is a macro secular change, and that this is not going to stop. We may call it something different. It might have different standards attached, but this will continue. Grow. Consumers are demanding it, capital is demanding it, regulators will demand it. And so as you think about investing in your own firm and frankly in your own careers, I think this will create gainful employment for everyone. And so we need a lot of folks who are committed to acting like leaders and thought leaders in the space, because we all need to figure out how to practice this. And so I would lean in because I think it will advantage you and advantage your firms if you do it.